All right, let's talk about section 1 of chapter 14. This chapter is on human heredity, and there'll be some concepts that we've talked about in the past when we talked about Mendel and Mendelian genetics, but there's going to be some new stuff as well. Um, so, first of all, the genome. What is the genome? Well, it is basically the sum total of all the genes you have. Um, and the chromosomes they're on. So, for example, in people, in humans, we have our 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs, with 2 copies of each chromosome and 2 copies of each gene, essentially, and we have approximately 25,000 genes in our genome. Um, so that makes up the whole genome, and of course, the number of genes will vary between different species and number of chromosomes as well. Now you can look at all the chromosomes in what's called a karyotype, which is essentially a picture of all the chromosomes. Now this picture is typically taken during either prophase or metaphase of mitosis, and each chromosome is essentially the picture of that chromosome is cut out, if you will, and they're arranged in their homologous pairs from basically largest to smallest. And so you have the pair of number 1 chromosomes, pair of number 2, 3, 4, etc., um, up through the 22nd pair. And in a karyotype, the last pair is always the sex chromosomes, the X and the Y. Um, and so this individual has one X and one Y, so they are a male. Um, this karyotype here has 2 X's and no Y, so of course this is a female. But again, there's all the other pairs in the karyotype. The karyotype um, can be useful because it can show you if there's any significant chromosomal errors at all. If there's missing chromosomes, extra chromosomes, or portions of chromosomes that are missing, for example. And of course, it can tell you the gender of the individual. So karyotypes are sometimes used in what's called prenatal diagnosis when you get DNA from the baby in utero and can tell some things about that baby. All right, now let's look at the sex chromosomes for a moment. So again, we have the X and the Y. The X is much larger and has more genes on it than the Y. Uh, Females have 2 X's, males have 1 X and 1 Y. And so um, sex determination, the gender of the offspring, is determined by the father, the male, because of course all the female can contribute as an X, but the male can contribute an X and a Y, and on average, half his gametes will have an X and half will have a Y. So offspring should be divided relatively equally between males and females. I have some links here to the X and the Y chromosome. And notice this one here, the Y chromosome vanishing. There's been some hypotheses about the Y chromosome having gotten smaller over evolutionary time. And there are some examples in animals of species that have lost the Y chromosome. And so there's these notions that will this someday happen in people? Um, I want you to take note of some of these particular genes that are pointed out here. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, X inactivation, hemophilia, color blindness, um, because we're going to talk in a little bit about this phenomenon called X linkage. Um, but now, So we have the two sex chromosomes, again, which are always the last ones shown in the karyotype. And in the karyotype, the rest of them, all the other chromosomes, are known as autosomes. So you can have autosomal traits, you can have traits that are found on the X chromosome, and a few that are found on the Y chromosome. So you hear that term, autosomal trait, it just means it's on one of the other 22 pairs of chromosomes, not on the X or the Y. All right, inheritance patterns. So as we saw with Mendel, we can talk about traits that are dominant and traits that are recessive. And so a trait that shows a recessive inheritance pattern, you'll notice that in order for one of the offspring to express it, both parents have to at least be carriers. Um, if neither parent is a carrier, none of the kids will express um, the recessive trait. Some of the kids might be carriers, but they won't express it. Now, with dominant inheritance, notice that it only takes one of the parents having the trait for at least half of the kids to express it. Um, so, on average, dominant traits tend to be expressed more, all else being equal. Um, Now, if the dominant allele is very infrequent in a population, the dominant trait won't be expressed very much. Um, but if it's fairly common, then it'll be expressed quite a bit. Um, I have this picture of Reagan Abernathy here from the trip to Panama because she has red hair, and this is due to a recessive form of a gene that when a person inherits two copies of this recessive gene, they will have red hair. So Reagan, one from her dad and one from her mom, and she has said that her dad has sort of reddish, whoops, where did I just go? Let's go back. There we go. Has said that her dad has reddish hair. So her dad is probably little n, and her mom is a carrier because she does not have red hair. All right, here's something we talked about back in Mendel, this another type of inheritance pattern, codominance. This is where you have two alleles that are equally dominant to each other. Neither is dominant to the other. And so we have the big R allele and the little r. And notice when you got homozygous for the big R, then you have a red flower. And when you have homozygous for the little r, you get a white flower. But notice the heterozygotes are pink. They are neither red nor white. They are pink because they're codominant. So with codominance, with the heterozygote, you'll get a unique phenotype that is different from either of the homozygotes. In that previous chapter, and we often also talked about multiple alleles and how for some traits you have more than two alleles, and the blood types in people is a good example because you got the A, the B, and the O. Now, of course, any one individual only has two alleles, um, but that gives us a variety of genotypes. Whoops, I meant to write that the other way. AO, so these, of course, are A type, and then you have these, which are B type. And perhaps you remember here, this is the example where the two alleles are codominant because these individuals are AB, and you have to have both copies of the O to have O-type blood. Another example that's out there is coat color in rabbits, and notice this one there are four alleles. There's the sort of the dominant form, or what's sometimes in genetics called the wild type form, which essentially is the most common type, and that's brown fur. And notice they designated capital C with a plus, capital C with a plus. But then you have some recessive alleles, one which has a little c with a superscript of CH. That's what they call the chinchilla coloration, which is what the type of color that chinchillas normally have. Then you have the Himalayan, and then the albino. Now, these three are all recessive, so if an individual has at least one C plus allele, they will be brown regardless of what the other one is. Now, of course, this individual would be a carrier of the Himalayan fur color, but they're going to be brown. And the same here, this individual is a carrier of the chinchilla fur color. Um, Now, one thing you can contemplate, and I don't have the answer to this right now, but what happens with this individual? What would be their coat color? Or say this individual? Maybe someone can look that up and we'll talk about that class. All right, so we talked up here about the X and Y chromosomes, and so the X and Y chromosomes have certain genes on them, and so we describe these genes as being sex-linked. That is, they're found on one of the sex chromosomes. And so traits can be X-linked, which means they're found on the X chromosome, or they can be Y-linked, which means they're found on the Y chromosome. We don't talk about Y linkage all that much because it's a relatively small chromosome with not many genes on it, but the X chromosome is fairly large and has a number of genes on it, so that's the more common form of sex linkage we talk about. And you remember from above, there were certain traits, and one of them was color blindness, red-green color blindness. It's an X-linked trait. It's due to a recessive allele on the X chromosome. And so you notice here we have a father who is colorblind, a mother who is a carrier, and when you look at the possibilities in their offspring, you'll see that they'll have, here's a daughter who is not colorblind, a son who is not colorblind, but a daughter who is, and a son who is. Now, notice that the only way for them to have kids with the condition is that they is a mother who is a carrier. Um, in particular, the only way for there to be a daughter who has it is if there's a mother who's a carrier and a dad who has it. Just imagine if dad were normal, then this daughter would not be colorblind, but they would still have a son. So you can ponder that why it is that these X-linked recessive traits are more common in males. Okay, so color blindness, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, these things are all more common in males. All right, here's a phenomenon that's just relevant to females. It's called X inactivation. Of course, females have two X's, and in the cells throughout their body, one of those X's is typically inactivated. So in any given cell, a female is only expressing one of her X chromosomes. We see this dramatically in female cats that are calicos. Um, they have a gene that's responsible for making their coat color white, but then there's a second gene that can give them brown or sort of golden yellowish spots. And so we'll just designate these G and B. So in some cells, they're expressing the X chromosome that has for black, and in other cells, they're expressing the X chromosome for the gold or yellow color. So they end up as this patchwork of different sort of brown and yellow gold colors based on which X is being expressed. So essentially the cells in the skin here are expressing the G, and here they're expressing the black gene. All right, mitochondrial inheritance, that's not in the book, but we'll talk about it. The mitochondrion has a little bit of its own DNA. You only inherit this from your mother because the zygote is a fertilized egg, and so the mitochondria come from mom. Dad simply contributes DNA that's going to end up in the nucleus, and of course the female does as well. So of course the female contributes her 23 chromosomes, the dad her 23, but then there's this extra DNA in the mitochondria that's only inherited from females. Okay, I'm just about out of time, so we'll talk about family trees. I'm going to make another video.